When we look at it, we are seeing quite a lot of opportunities because I think the baby is being thrown out with the bathwater in this case.
So Daryl, Asia and emerging markets have been underperforming. Will we see a turnaround, or is this just another dead cat bounce?
Well, I think really things are starting to improve because if you look at it, as you pointed out, emerging markets have been under a lot of pressure over the last few years. But however, this year, things seem to have turned for the better. I think one of the main aspects is that, on the macro side, Fed rate expectations have moderated significantly. And as a result of that, US dollar has basically started to weaken. I think one of the issues that have been plaguing emerging markets has been dollar strength, and when dollar strengthens, usually emerging markets kind of come under a bit of pressure. So far, year to date, dollar has weakened against a lot of the emerging market currencies, and that's really lessened some of the pressure on those markets, and actually they've outperformed.
So China had a rocky start to the year. China has stabilised now. Is this just a short-term measure, or will the problems re-emerge?
Well, China's had has been coming under a lot of pressure. If you look at the volatility that has affected global markets since the beginning of the year, a large chunk of that has been due to China. And in January, there were a whole bunch of policy mistakes. For example, the circuit breaker that they implemented that was set too low. And then you had lack of communication in terms of how the renminbi would be managed against the US dollar and this basket of foreign currencies. But actually, since January, February, since then, the Chinese government has actually learned from the mistakes they've made. They've improved communication. They've cut out all those policies that haven't worked. And then most importantly as well, as a result of the latest NPC meeting, which is the big meeting of the Politburo and the government leaders, Premier Li Keqiang came out and basically said that China is going to hit that 6.5% GDP growth rate this year. And that helped stabilize global markets because everybody was concerned about hard landing in China. After Premier Li's comment there, economic numbers started to improve a bit. Government started to take various measures to prop up the domestic economy, and things have actually stabilized over the past couple of months.
And Japan has been lagging the stock markets in recent years. Do you see any opportunities or bright spots left in Japan?
Yeah, Japan's a tough one because since Abenomics, Prime Minister Abe came in a couple of years ago, and his three-fangled, three arrows under Abenomics, there was a lot of optimism, that things would turn around. The first two arrows have kind of kicked off already. The third arrow, structural reforms, I think is happening, but it takes time for that to materialize. But if you look at performance of the Japanese market on a year-to-date basis, it's one of the biggest laggards on the year for this year, and the prime reason for that is the strength in the Japanese yen, and the fact that people are concerned that the structural reforms aren't really happening. But when we look at it, we are seeing quite a lot of opportunities because I think the baby is being thrown out with the bathwater in this case. There's been a lot of indiscriminate selling across the board for Japanese names. And when we look at individual stock picks, we find quite a number of compelling ideas. I mean, there are a couple of interesting themes for Japan, one of which is tourism. No doubt Japanese yen has strengthened a bit this year, but if you look at the trend over the last few years, Japanese yen has actually weakened vis-a-vis the US dollar. So everybody I know, people in Singapore, in the rest of the world, they've been actually looking at holidaying in Japan, because things are a lot cheaper now compared to like 5 years ago. So the tourism trend is one that I think is really starting to pick up. I think they're looking at something like 14 million tourist arrivals for this year. That's going to hit like 20 million in a couple of years' time. And don't forget, you've got Tokyo Olympics coming up in 2020 as well. So I think the tourism trend is one that's quite interesting. And the other aspect is one of reflation as well. Property market in Japan, in Tokyo, has been depressed for a number of years. That seemingly is starting to turn around because negative interest rates, so borrowing is cheap. A number of other housing markets globally are probably peaking, in the UK, for example, in other parts of Asia. So quite a number of clients are actually looking at possibly buying real estate in Japan. So there are a couple of secular themes that could be quite interesting investment opportunities in Japan.
And Southeast Asian markets have been outperforming its neighbours. Any major themes you've seen there? Yeah,
Southeast Asian markets, I mean, there are a couple of issues, namely geopolitical. Philippines just had elections where They had a Donald Trump type of president, President Duterte, who just came on, who has hogged a lot of headlines because of the radical comments he makes. And then you've got Thailand as well, which is facing some issues with how the government is going to be, the legitimacy of the government, as well as whether the king, his health is in quite poor health at this point in time. What's going to happen when he eventually passes on. But having said that, I think there's a couple of positive aspects that have helped Southeast Asian markets. One of which is there is the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which a number of countries, including the US, obviously are signatories to. And that would actually help quite a number of countries. Vietnam, for example, is one of the biggest beneficiaries of TPP, as long as countries can actually ratify that. What that basically means is that there's going to be a lot more foreign direct investment that comes in to build factories, industrialize these places. So there are quite a lot of opportunities in that sense. And then also, no doubt we're having all these problems with Brexit and EU. But in Southeast Asia, there's something called the ASEAN Economic Community, AEC, which is supposed to have kicked off this year, where they're looking at reducing tariffs of trade within these 10 member countries. All this will actually help boost economic activity as well. And besides that, I think Southeast Asia is also one of the key beneficiaries of China's One Belt strategy. China is now trying to actually widen their influence on the rest of Asia, and one of the aspects is actually to invest more in infrastructure across of Asia. So they've got a two-pronged strategy. One is over land, and one is by sea. And so they're pumping in money to build railways, to build shipping ports, for example, within the region, which will also help boost trade, mobility of people within these countries. So there are quite a number of interesting opportunities that Southeast Asia has to look forward to.
Thank you, Daryl. It's been a pleasure having you in our studios.
Most welcome.
That's all for today's interview, but you can get the latest by following us on Facebook or by downloading our app. Goodbye for now.